Hello there, Night Owl. Before we begin our trip into the past, I want to say hello to you, wherever you are, morning, afternoon, or night. I'm happy you chose to join this calm journey through the lives of those who came before us. If you want, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always interesting to see the many places and time zones that make up this community of history lovers and curious minds. If you like stories that mix learning with relaxation, please think about subscribing so you don't miss future trips back in time. Now, get comfortable and relax as I gently take you to a very different era and world. Tonight, we will look at what life was like for women in medieval Europe, a time stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century. This was a world of knights and castles, plagues and crusades, towering cathedrals, and large manor houses. It was a time filled with change and unrest, yet also stuck in old traditions and strict social rules. For most women during this time, daily life was very different from the dreamy stories of chivalry, courtly romance, and fairy tale princesses we often imagine today. The truth was often hard, unfair, and full of limits. From birth until death, women had few rights or freedoms and were usually under the control of men, first their fathers, then their husbands, with little say over their own futures. Of course, life was not the same for every woman. A rich noblewoman lived very differently from a poor peasant girl. But across all classes, women shared many basic struggles rooted deeply in the culture and customs of the time. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore many sides of medieval women's lives. We'll follow the path from childhood through youth, marriage, motherhood, and old age. We'll look at their daily duties, their place in family and society, the health problems and hardships they faced, and the strict moral rules they had to follow. Along the way, I will tell you the personal stories of some real medieval women whose lives were recorded in history: queens, common women, nuns, noblewomen, healers, and those accused of heresy, each adding a unique voice to this complex time. Before we dive fully into the past, picture this world, lit only by firelight, with life ruled by the rising and setting of the sun. A land of extremes, where a few lived in grand luxury, while many suffered in deep poverty. Imagine stone castles with high towers watching over the countryside. Nearby, small thatched cottages huddled around a manor house, smoke curling up from their chimneys. Far away, the tall spires of a great cathedral pierced the sky, bells ringing to mark the day's prayer times. The air would be thick with smells of wood smoke, fresh bread baking, and farm animals. The sounds were a mix of barking dogs, noisy livestock, ringing hammer blows from blacksmiths, and chopping axes from woodcutters. People worked hard from sunrise to sunset, with little time to rest in their daily fight to survive. Into this world, a medieval girl was born. From the moment she took her first breath, life was stacked against her in ways hard for us today to imagine. In our modern world of advanced medicine, human rights, and equality, it's sobering to see how harsh life was for women long ago. As we walk in their footsteps tonight, it's important to remember that we see their world through our 21st century eyes. We can't judge them by today's standards. Our goal is to understand the conditions they lived in, to listen to their stories openly, and to see both how far we've come and how far we still must go for gender equality. Let's begin at the start, the fragile early years of a medieval girl. Childhood was short and dangerous, especially for girls. Many children did not survive past their 5th birthday. Illness, hunger, and accidents took countless young lives, making every cradle a place shadowed by loss. For those lucky enough to grow beyond infancy, childhood was not the carefree time of play and learning we think of today. Instead, children were seen as small adults, expected to help their families as soon as they could walk and talk. Childhood was a time to prepare for grown-up responsibilities. For girls, this meant learning domestic tasks almost exclusively. While some boys might attend school or learn from priests, most girls were taught at home. From a young age, girls were taught their place in society. Modesty, obedience, and submission were key lessons, along with cooking, sewing, spinning wool, and caring for children and the sick. Mothers, grandmothers, and older sisters showed them these skills by example. Religious stories and church teachings reinforced their roles as followers in a world designed by God to keep men in charge. Only a few noble women learned to read and write. For most girls, formal education was nearly unheard of. Female literacy was very low, even among the wealthy. Instead, girls were prepared for their main future role, becoming wives and mothers. Childhood ended suddenly with puberty and marriage. Marriage in the Middle Ages was mostly a practical deal to build family ties, strengthen wealth, and have children, not about love or personal happiness. Fathers or male relatives arranged marriages, with little say from the girls themselves. The legal minimum age for girls to marry was 12, though most married later, especially peasants who needed their daughters to help at home longer. Still, in noble families, very young girls could be married to older men for political reasons. Imagine the fear a young girl must have felt leaving her family to live with strangers. One example is Isabeau of Bavaria, married at 15 to King Charles V of France, who was 16 years older. Taken from minor nobility for a political alliance, she was unprepared for royal duties. Her main task was to have a male heir, a pressure that shaped her entire married life. From today's point of view, it's hard to grasp the physical and emotional challenges these young brides faced, torn from their childhood and thrown into demanding new roles. Many must have felt deeply lonely and lost. Wedding ceremonies back then were much simpler than what we might imagine today. There was none of the fancy white dresses or grand parties that became common in later centuries. For ordinary people, a simple promise made in front of a few witnesses, often with a priest present, was enough to make a marriage official. Only the wealthy nobles could afford large celebrations, and even then, these events focused more on joining two families together than celebrating the couple themselves. The bride's identity was basically transferred from her father's control to her husband's, as if she became part of his household. In many cases, marriage meant a clear break from the woman's family. While poor peasant brides often stayed near their parents, it was customary for a wife to move into her husband's home. There, she had to quickly learn the family's rules, get along with her new relatives, and find her place in the household hierarchy. This could be very difficult, especially for young brides who were still figuring out how to manage a household. But no responsibility weighed heavier on a young wife than the need to have children, soon and often. In a time with little medical knowledge and high death rates, pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous. Many women lost their lives during this process. Next time, we'll explore the ups and downs of motherhood in medieval times. The pressure to have sons, the shame for those who only had daughters, and the heartbreak of losing children. We'll get to know Eleanor of Castile, a queen whose life was shaped by these struggles. Until then, take a moment to think about the little girls of that era, the future brides and mothers whose childhoods ended almost before they began. Imagine them in their embroidered slippers, facing a harsh and uncertain future. Rest well, and when we meet again, we will uncover more hidden stories of women from history whose voices deserve to be heard no matter how distant or difficult their lives may seem. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sweet dreams until next time. As we have seen, medieval women lived under strict control from birth to death. Their lives were governed by the men around them, fathers, husbands, brothers, priests, and they had little say over their own bodies, minds, or futures. Male authorities kept a close watch and were quick to punish any missteps. The harsh moral rules of the time, deeply rooted in religious beliefs, put women in a nearly impossible position. On one side, the church taught that women were sinful and weak, descendants of Eve, who tempted men. Their beauty was viewed as dangerous, something that could lead men astray. Women were expected to cover their hair and dress modestly to avoid provoking male desire. At the same time, as wives and mothers, they had to be obedient, chaste, and pure. Any sign of flirtation or improper behavior could ruin a woman's reputation. Adultery was always blamed on the wife, even if the husband was unfaithful. A jealous husband could accuse his wife of cheating, and the punishments were cruel and humiliating. Women might be paraded through town, half naked, with a crier announcing their sins. They could be whipped, dunked in water, or locked in stocks while townspeople mocked and threw rotten food. In the worst cases, the punishment was death. And a woman didn't even have to break a law to face public shame, gossip, scolding, or nagging could lead to punishment like the scold's bridle, a metal device placed over the head to hold down the tongue while she was paraded around town. For those women who chose religious life, freedom was still hard to find. Nuns lived strict lives filled with prayer and silence, dressed in plain habits, and were expected to be seen but not heard. Some even locked themselves away as anchoresses, women walled into tiny cells attached to churches, with only a small window for food and communion. They rarely ever left. One famous anchoress was Julian of Norwich, who after surviving a serious illness and experiencing visions, chose to live in complete isolation. She spent decades in prayer and wrote a book called Revelations of Divine Love, believed to be the first English book written by a woman. For Julian, her confinement brought spiritual freedom, but for most women, such isolation was a grim sentence. While Julian wrote quietly in her cell, most medieval women worked themselves to exhaustion. Their daily lives were brutal. Domestic violence was common and seen as a husband's right to discipline his wife. Even noble women were vulnerable, as shown by the story of Marguerite Flanders, daughter of King Louis II. Instead of a glorious marriage, she was kidnapped multiple times by her cruel husband, Davs, who kept her imprisoned and abused for years. After many children and endless suffering, she fled to her father's court for help. Sadly, the king sided with her husband after legal arguments claimed a wife was basically her husband's property. Marguerite was forced back to her abuser until his death. Her tragic story was far from unique. Women were treated like possessions. Without family or money, common women had no protection and were seen as disposable. A rural woman worked from dawn to dusk in the fields or hauling water and firewood, her body breaking under the strain. If she survived childbirth, she still faced hunger, disease, and filth. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were constant companions, and she aged quickly under such hardship. For unmarried women, life was even harder. Many turned to begging or prostitution to survive, but society viewed them with suspicion. Women were expected to be under a man's control, a husband or male relative, and without that, they were seen as dangerous and unnatural. Prostitutes lived on society's edges. Cities like London had official red light districts where brothels could operate legally, but women caught working outside those areas faced harsh punishments like fines and time in stocks. Even as difficult as their lives were, prostitutes sometimes fared better than women who fell into vagrancy or crime, who faced brutal punishments from the law. Medieval justice was harsh. Women could be whipped, branded, or mutilated for petty crimes like stealing. But all women, from princesses to prostitutes, lived under a darker threat, the constant danger of violence. In medieval times, the threat of violence against women was constant and terrifying. Men from all social levels, nobles and peasants alike, often treated the women in their lives as objects to be controlled and exploited. The idea of consent was almost non-existent. Only if a woman was an unmarried virgin from a respected family might her accusations of assault be taken seriously. Even then, the best outcome she could expect was that her attacker would be pressured to marry her. After all, he had ruined her honor, so marrying her was seen as the least he could do. The woman's feelings or wishes were not part of the equation. One of the most frightening dangers for medieval women was the fear of being accused of witchcraft. In times when poor harvests or sick animals could threaten entire communities, women who were different or knowledgeable about healing were easy targets. Midwives and healers, women who helped ease childbirth or cared for the sick, were especially at risk. If a crop failed or a child became ill, they could be blamed for using dark magic. Witch trials were show trials, with outcomes decided before they even began. Accused women were stripped and searched for a devil's mark, a spot or mole believed to prove guilt. Confessions were often forced through torture, but refusing to confess was also seen as proof of guilt. The innocent were doomed either way. Those deemed witches might face public humiliation, dunking in water, whipping, or locking in stocks while townsfolk jeered. Many were burned alive in front of crowds. These trials were fueled by deep hatred and fear of women, sending a brutal message that a single misstep could mean death. Yet, despite this harsh oppression and constant danger, some medieval women found ways to resist and assert themselves. Christine de Pizan was one such remarkable figure. She became one of the first professional female writers, boldly challenging the widespread hatred of women in male scholarly works. Her book, The Book of the City of Ladies, gathered stories of powerful women and confronted sexist arguments head-on. As a widow supporting her family, Christine faced scorn from male intellectuals but kept fighting for women's moral and intellectual equality long before feminism took shape. For everyday women, resistance often took quieter forms. They depended on each other during childbirth, shared childcare, and formed bonds through daily life. Mothers taught their daughters survival skills, how to manage a household, handle marriage, and endure hardship, arming the next generation for the challenges ahead. Though life was brutal and full of suffering, women were not just victims. They showed grit, strength, and resilience. When we look back on medieval womanhood, the picture is grim. Hard work, suffering, and submission were everyday realities. But it's important to remember women were never simply powerless. They carved out spaces of agency, fought back in their own ways, and carried forward an unbreakable spirit. Thinking about how far we've come is encouraging. The idea that women are property to be used and discarded by men is now rightly condemned. While accusations of witchcraft still occur in some places, women are no longer burned for crimes they didn't commit. But we must stay clear-eyed about ongoing injustices faced by women worldwide. The forms may have changed, but the struggle for true equality continues. Medieval misogyny may feel like ancient history, but its echoes still touch our lives today. As you drift off to sleep, remember the courage of the women before us. They endured what seems unbearable and lit the way for future generations. We stand on the shoulders of these medieval women, and it's our duty to keep working toward a world where every woman can live with dignity, safety, and freedom. The path is long, but as Christine de Pizan wrote, women have been defenseless for too long. Brick by brick, we are proving otherwise and building a new reality. Medieval women lived in darkness, but their spirits shone like candles in the night, guiding us forward. That, my friends, is history worth remembering. Life was grim for medieval women in other ways too. Poor hygiene and lack of sanitation made everyday living unpleasant, especially for managing monthly cycles. Without modern products, most women used homemade cloth pads or rags, washed and reused. These offered little protection from leaks or discomfort. Some resorted to stuffing their undergarments with grass, hay, wool, or moss. Chafing and infections were common problems. Bathing was rare, especially for poorer women. Even if they had access to rivers or streams, The water was often dirty and disease-ridden. Many believed water could carry illness through the skin's pores, so bathing might only happen a few times a year, replaced by sponge baths. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Laundry was a back-breaking task. Clothes had to be washed by hand in boiling pots or rivers, scrubbed on washboards, wrung out, and hung to dry. The process was exhausting and time-consuming. Wet clothes near fires were a fire risk, and most families had only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, worn until threadbare. Nobles had somewhat better hygiene, with servants to heat water, prepare baths, and clean clothes more often. They used scented oils and herbs to mask odors. But even the grandest castles had no running water, flush toilets, or proper waste disposal. Chamber pots were emptied out windows onto courtyards. It's telling that a prized wedding gift for an aristocratic bride was a flea fur. A fur wrap meant to attract fleas away from the body. Rats carried fleas that spread the deadly bubonic plague. When the Black Death struck Europe in the 14th century, it wiped out an estimated 60% of the population. Women were at the forefront of nursing the sick and mourning the dead. The plague shook society and sped changes in medical practices. Women cared for the ill as wives, mothers, midwives, and nuns. Doctors were rare and costly, so women's care was vital. Convents often became hospitals for the poor. Elderly nuns passed herbal remedies to novices. Some women became midwives, apothecaries, or surgeons. In 14th century Paris, Jacqueline Felicia de Almenia faced trial for practicing medicine illegally as a woman. Her patients, including priests and nobles, praised her skills. Yet, she was excommunicated and banned from practicing. Few women succeeded in the male-dominated medical world. More often, home remedies were dismissed as witchcraft. Anyone challenging church-approved teachings risked being branded a heretic or witch. Midwives lived under constant threat of being accused of witchcraft, especially if a mother or baby died during childbirth. Women skilled in herbs and remedies, for easing pain or even ending pregnancies, could be labeled as servants of the devil. A village's wise woman might be respected for her healing in youth but feared and shunned as a witch in old age. Once accused, women faced harsh interrogations and torture to force confessions. Proving innocence was nearly impossible, especially for unmarried or elderly women without male protectors. Between 1500 and 1660, women made up over 80% of the 50,000 to 100,000 people executed for witchcraft. These witch hunts were the extreme expression of a society desperate to control and punish women who challenged social norms. Even women who tried to be perfect wives, mothers, and devout Christians were viewed as weak and flawed, forever marked by Eve's original sin. Their role was clear: submission and service within the home, away from the world. Stepping outside that domestic sphere invited unwanted male attention and risked a woman's reputation. Unmarried women were seen as liabilities, unable to fulfill their purpose of bearing children. Married women were considered their husband's property, to be protected or punished as he wished, regardless of her feelings. A woman's value was tied to her ability to bear children. Pregnancy brought hope but also fear, as childbirth was extremely dangerous. Noble women were judged by their success in producing a surviving male heir. Queens who failed to have a son might be cast aside for more fertile wives. The fates of Henry VIII's 6 wives are grim examples of this harsh reality. Peasant women faced even greater dangers, with poor nutrition and living conditions leading to deformities like rickets, which made labor more difficult and dangerous. Childbirth often took days or even a week, full of pain and uncertainty. When labor stalled, a midwife might place the Virgin Mary's sacred birthing girdle on the mother's stomach, hoping it would help, though it offered no real medical aid. Midwives relied on herbs and salves, but their success depended mostly on luck. Girls born into noble families often married young, sometimes well before turning 18. Political alliances and family power mattered more than a girl's readiness or wishes. Even queens like Isabeau of Bavaria faced the same pressures to produce male heirs and endured the dangers of childbirth. Queen Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, survived 16 pregnancies over 28 years in the late 13th century, though many of her children died young. Her life showed the incredible strength and resilience required of medieval women. For most women, daily life was a relentless cycle of hard work. If not cooking, cleaning, sewing, or caring for children, they labored alongside their husbands in the fields or gathered water and firewood. Privacy was rare. Families lived in small, cramped spaces where everyone shared beds and close quarters, which could cause tension among couples and family members. Hygiene was poor by modern standards. Fleas, lice, and other pests were constant nuisances. Chamber pots were kept close and emptied out windows, leading to filthy streets. Disease spread easily in such conditions. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of medieval women's lives was their lack of control over their own futures. The idea of personal freedom was almost non-existent. From birth to death, a woman's path was decided by the men around her: fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. Even talented and intelligent women struggled to live independently. Christine de Pizan was a rare exception. After losing her husband young, she supported herself and her children by writing professionally. In her groundbreaking work, The Book of the City of Ladies, she imagined a city filled with famous women from history and mythology, a bold challenge to the widespread belief that women were weak and incapable of reason or virtue. Christine's proto-feminist ideas were centuries ahead of her time. For most women, their bodies were not their own. They were subject to their husband's desires and abuse, with little protection. Marital rape was unrecognized. Wives were considered property. Domestic violence was accepted as a husband's right. If a wife complained, she was often blamed for provoking his anger. Even noble women had little defense. Marguerite, Countess of Flanders, was abducted, imprisoned, and threatened with execution by her cruel husband Louis of Maille in the 14th century, a horrifying real-life tragedy. The Church, which shaped all aspects of medieval life, reinforced these harsh views. Since Eve's fall from grace, women were seen as sinful temptresses, morally weak and dangerous. Female sexuality was tightly controlled. A woman's duty was to remain pure, ideally as a virgin consecrated to Christ, or else as a faithful wife and mother. Women who stepped outside these roles faced ruin, punishment, or even death. Some women sought refuge from the dangers of the world in religious life. Julian of Norwich, an English mystic, chose to be enclosed in a small cell attached to a church in the early 15th century. Receiving food through a small window, she spent decades in solitude, prayer, and contemplation. She wrote remarkable spiritual revelations during her confinement. For Julian, this life offered safety and purpose. For others, it was a form of prison. Life for medieval women was defined by limits. Limits on their opportunities, their bodies, and their spirits. Bound by strict gender roles and religious doctrine, confined to the home, many died young after a life of hardship. Yet women found ways to leave their mark, to assert their will and resist oppression, sometimes with quiet courage, sometimes with fierce determination. Through tears, toil, faith, and fury, they endured. Those centuries have brought progress and freedom. Echoes of medieval misogyny still linger today. The struggle continues. The struggles we face today, unequal treatment, control over women's bodies, violence based on gender, and discrimination, echo many of the same battles our ancestors fought. Learning about the hardships of those who came before helps us appreciate their courage and see how far we still need to go. When we remember the women of long ago, we honor their sacrifices and unyielding spirit in the face of hardship. We owe it to them to work toward a world where a woman's value isn't tied to the sons she bears or the home she manages, but to her mind, her kindness, her passion, and the strength of her soul. Try to picture a typical medieval peasant's home, a cold, dark, and cramped 1- or 2-room hut. The walls were made from wooden stakes woven with sticks, packed tight with a rough mix of mud, straw, and manure. The floor was hard dirt, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. If a family was a little better off, they might have some wooden planks laid over the dirt, but that did little to keep out the damp chill rising from the ground. The thatched roof above might block most rain, but it was a constant fight to patch leaks and keep vermin out. In one corner of this bleak hut, a woman crouched by the hearth, tending the smoky fire. Her face was streaked with soot, her simple wool dress worn and patched. Her rough, cracked hands moved expertly over a cast iron pot, stirring a thin vegetable pottage, the staple meal of the peasant family. On rare feast days, a scrap of salted pork might be added if they were lucky. This was the realm of the medieval housewife, a suffocating world confined within mud walls and muddy village paths. From dawn till dusk, her life was an endless cycle of labor, feeding the fire, carrying water, cooking, spinning wool, sewing, washing, scrubbing, and caring for her husband and children. The old saying, "A woman's work is never done," was never truer than then. While her husband worked in the fields or practiced a trade like blacksmithing or carpentry, her place was fixed firmly at home, as a devoted caretaker with no space for her own needs or dreams. Her tools were simple: a couple of cast iron pots, wooden bowls and utensils, a stone quern to grind grain into flour, a spindle, and a distaff to spin wool into thread. With these meager implements, she performed domestic miracles, stretching scarce resources to feed and clothe her family. Yet even as she stirred the pottage or nibbled the dense black bread that was the peasant's staple, her mind might wander. Perhaps she thought of the village priest's sermon about the Virgin Mary, the perfect woman who gave birth to the Savior. Could there be more to a woman's life than this endless hard work? Such thoughts were dangerous. For a medieval woman, the path to salvation was through humble submission, to her husband and to God. To dream of more was to risk being labeled proud, stubborn, or even a witch. Better to keep her head down, protect her virtue, and pray for a better life after death. In this harsh world, hardship and servitude were her lot, and woe to any woman who dared challenge that. Among the rare women who dared to dream differently was Christine de Pizan, born in Venice in 1364. Her father, a well-known physician and astrologer, secured a position at King Charles V of France's court when Christine was a child. Growing up in this royal and intellectual environment, Christine received the best education possible for a medieval girl. She learned to read and write Latin and French, studied classical literature and philosophy, and had access to the king's grand library, a treasure trove unknown to most. Her father, progressive for his time, encouraged her learning. At 15, Christine married Etienne de Castel, a nobleman. Their marriage, like most, was arranged, but they grew to love and respect each other deeply. Christine became a loving wife and mother of 3. But tragedy soon struck. In her 20s, she lost her husband to plague and then her father. Alone, a widow and orphan, Christine faced a world that valued educated women little without male protection. Refusing to be defeated, Christine made a bold choice. She would support her family through writing. Becoming one of Europe's first professional female authors, she entered the male-dominated world of literature. She began with love ballads and devotional poems, safe genres for a woman, but soon tackled heavier subjects. Her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, was a passionate defense of women against the deep-seated misogyny of her era. With clear, sharp prose, Christine dismantled the idea that women were naturally inferior to men in morals or intellect. She argued women had equal capacity for virtue, knowledge, and leadership, if only society allowed them to prove it. To illustrate her point, Christine shared vivid stories of extraordinary women throughout history. Hypatia of Alexandria, the scholar murdered for teaching philosophy and math, Queen Semiramis of Assyria, a brilliant conqueror, and Hildegard of Bingen, a mystic and composer revered across Christendom. Each tale chipped away at prejudice, making a powerful case for gender equality. Christine's ideas found a small but growing audience of educated women inspired by her courage. But the male establishment often mocked and dismissed her, branding her a shrill or deluded woman. Her lifelong battle for respect reflected the enormous barriers medieval women faced when seeking roles beyond hearth and home. Still, Christine refused silence and wrote prolifically until her death around 1430. Her legacy shines as proof that one woman's voice can echo through history. As we continue exploring medieval women's lives, keep Christine in mind as a rare spark in a dark age. For most women, independence was an impossible dream. The story of Marguerite, Countess of Flanders, shows even high-born women had little control over their lives. Despite wealth and status, Marguerite was still at the mercy of the men around her, traded like property and treated as possession. The reality of medieval women's lives was harsh, and the lack of consequences for acts like the brutal abduction of Marguerite of Flanders highlights how gender-based abuse was often ignored or accepted. A woman's well-being was rarely a priority. For women of lower social standing, things were even grimmer. Without wealth or status to protect them, peasant women were easy targets for exploitation by lords, masters, and even their own husbands or fathers. Domestic violence was widespread, seen not as a crime but as a man's rightful way to control his wife and daughters. Church teachings reinforced this, teaching women to obey and submit, and violence was considered an acceptable form of discipline if they stepped out of line. The law offered little help. Women couldn't file complaints, seek separation, or gain justice on their own in most places. Neighbors rarely intervened, as domestic troubles were seen as private matters. Unless the abuse became publicly notorious, women were expected to endure it silently. Leaving a marriage meant risking social ruin. Only in the most severe cases could noble women appeal to family or church, but even then, support was uncertain. Since a wife was considered her husband's property, he could treat her as he pleased behind closed doors. Many abused wives were sent back to their tormentors unless their families had the means to quietly place them in convents. Marguerite's story is a stark example of this vulnerability. Born in 1350 as the only daughter and heir of Louis II, Count of Flanders, she was a valuable prize in the medieval marriage market. Married off at 11 to Philip of Rouvres, Duke of Burgundy, she became a wealthy widow as a teenager when he died. Her father arranged a new match to Philip the Bold of Burgundy, but her cousin Louis III of Flanders sought to keep power in the family. In a brazen move, he abducted Marguerite and took her to Ghent against her will. Though her father eventually reclaimed her and annulled the marriage arrangement, this episode shows how elite women were mere pawns in men's power struggles, their rights and feelings disregarded. This casual misogyny seeped into all aspects of medieval women's lives, including religion. The Catholic Church's teachings were deeply tied to ideas of female subordination, sinfulness, and temptation. Since Eve's fall, women were viewed as morally weaker and more prone to vice. They were thought to be lustful, vain, emotionally unstable, and intellectually inferior, justifying their control by supposedly rational men. Virtuous women were expected to be obedient, chaste, modest, quiet, and diligent in domestic tasks. serving fathers, brothers, and husbands. Any deviation from this ideal was condemned. Outspoken, defiant, or ambitious women were seen as unnatural threats to society. Women involved in unsanctioned sexual acts, sex outside marriage, adultery, prostitution, were branded as wicked temptresses, despite men often coercing or exploiting them first. The worst label a woman could receive was witch. Witchcraft was portrayed as the ultimate feminine evil, a woman in league with the devil, wielding supernatural power to undermine male authority and corrupt others. Accused witches were often social outcasts, widows, elderly unmarried women, midwives, herbalists, beggars, or those who didn't fit the mold of wife and mother. They became scapegoats for community misfortunes like bad harvests or disease. Witch hunts, especially in the early modern period, had their roots in the medieval church's fear of uncontrolled female power. With flimsy evidence, women were tortured and executed by burning, hanging, or drowning. These hunts were brutal reminders of how deeply the church and society feared and sought to control women. Most women, however, lived far from power. Whether noble or peasant, their lives were tightly controlled with limited agency. Religion offered one of the few outlets for autonomy and self-expression, though heavily regulated. Becoming a nun was a rare escape from marriage, allowing some women to devote themselves to spiritual life and learning, protected from male demands. Female mystics were sometimes respected if their visions aligned with church doctrine. Julian of Norwich, an English anchoress, lived a radical monastic life, choosing to be enclosed in a small cell attached to a church in her 30s. Her door was sealed behind her in a ceremony symbolizing her permanent isolation. For decades, Julian lived in solitude, receiving food through a small window. Though deprived of freedom, this life was preferable to marriage for some. As an anchoress, Julian answered prayers and offered counsel, gaining rare influence and authority. Her spiritual writings, including revelations of divine love, boldly described God in feminine terms, a daring act at the time. The survival of her work reflects the respect she earned, but her life was still one of hardship, controlled by a patriarchal society that viewed women as threats to be confined. Women's lives were defined by narrow roles, forced choices, and denied dreams. Submission, silence, and survival were the demands placed on them. Medieval women might not have used modern terms like equality or justice, but they keenly felt their restrictions as a slow suffocation and a closing of possibilities. Yet they endured. They found small lights in the darkness, pride in their children, their crafts, their faith. They held together families and communities, doing all they could to survive. Through their sacrifices, strength, and quiet resilience, medieval women laid the groundwork for future generations' freedoms and progress. As we close our eyes tonight, let's honor the forgotten women of the past, the ones whose lives might have been different in a world that truly valued them. Let's carry their stories forward, recognizing both how far we've come and how much work remains. After all, women's history is human history, and our freedom is tied together. Rest well, dear listener, and dream of kinder days ahead. Marguerite's harsh story shows just how vulnerable even noble women were in medieval society. Their choices mattered little, and wives especially were treated as property to be claimed and controlled. This lack of respect for women's bodily autonomy was common at all levels. Domestic violence was widespread, with husbands legally allowed to physically discipline their wives. A 15th-century law called the Liber Extra even stated a man could beat his wife for her own correction because she belonged to him. Peasant women often bore the brunt of husbands' frustrations from hard labor, poor food, and cramped living. Privacy was nearly non-existent, and wine, ale, and unsafe water only added to tempers. Aristocratic husbands might restrain their violence to avoid marks on their wives' appearances, But abuse was still common, just more hidden. A noblewoman remained her lord's property, expected to submit fully. Marital rape wasn't recognized as a crime. Marriage was about producing heirs, so husbands had the right to sex regardless of their wives' consent. Church teachings painted women as sinful and lustful creatures needing male control. Female desire was seen as unnatural, while male desire was excused. If a husband forced himself on his wife, blame fell on her supposed provocation. Medical ideas of the time reinforced this. Texts claimed female seed needed stimulation from vigorous male action to conceive, and that women's pleasure was necessary for pregnancy. By this logic, a pregnant wife was assumed willing, no matter her true feelings. Victims of sexual violence faced scorn, disbelief, and accusations of tempting their attackers. One medieval poem even advised, "What you can't prevent you might as well enjoy." In such a grim reality, women sought ways to avoid unwanted pregnancies and shame. Midwives and healers shared secret recipes for herbal abortifacients and contraceptives. Pennyroyal, tansy, certain fungi could induce miscarriage. Rue, Queen Anne's lace, and wild carrot seed worked as birth control. These quiet acts of resistance risked hemorrhage, infection, and accusations of witchcraft. Medieval society could not accept women controlling their reproductive fate. Anything that challenged a husband's authority or God's will was seen as devil's work. Tragically, some women internalized their oppression, believing they deserved the abuses they suffered. When marriage was the only option and a husband was master, what choice was left but submission? Yet despite trauma of body and spirit, medieval women endured. They healed each other's wounds, whispered words of solidarity, and in quiet moments crafted lives that rose above their pain. Through sheer grit, they remained devoted wives, loving mothers, and keepers of self in a world that offered little. Among these women was an English mystic who became one of the most influential Christian theologians of her time, Julian of Norwich. But her cloistered life began not by choice, but as a last hope for an unmarriageable woman. Born in 1343, Julian likely came from a noble family fallen on hard times, without a dowry or powerful connections. She faced a bleak future, a burdensome spinster or backbreaking farm laborer. For women like Julian, the convent was both refuge and a chance at respectability. In her early 30s, she chose the extreme path of an anchoress, walled into a tiny cell attached to a church for the rest of her life. A solemn ceremony sealed her door, marking her symbolic death to the world. She entered her stone tomb while still alive, likely feeling both fear and relief. She escaped the exhausting trials of marriage and motherhood, but traded them for a life of solitude in a cramped space barely large enough to lie down. Yet for Julian, this harsh existence was freedom of a kind. Supported by alms, beholden to no man but Christ, her days were her own, spent in prayer and devotion. In a society where women's words were often dismissed, an anchoress council carried rare spiritual weight. Townsfolk came to her small windows seeking advice and prayers. In 1373, Julian experienced powerful visions during a near-fatal illness. These mystical revelations challenged harsh Christian teachings about sin, punishment, and God's wrath. Central to her vision was Jesus' mother, Mary, and the idea of God as a nurturing mother who loves all creation and would never condemn a beloved child to eternal hell. "God is our mother as truly as our father," she wrote. This gentle, maternal theology starkly opposed the patriarchal view of women as sinful temptresses. Julian saw male pride and selfishness as what spoiled God's perfect creation. Women like Mary embodied pure Christ-like love and mercy. When Julian wrote her Revelations of Divine Love, the first book in English written by a woman, her radical compassion reached beyond her cell to inspire many. Though imprisoned in stone, her mind and spirit roamed free, shaping religious thought for generations. She created a rich inner world full of meaning and beauty that stood strong against the harshness outside. For Julian and many solitary female mystics, the convent was both a sanctuary and a rare chance for intellectual and spiritual growth. Yet, Julian's unusual success doesn't erase the heartbreaking reality that for most medieval women, a lifetime of confinement was one of the few better options. The overwhelming majority never escaped the domestic prisons that held them from birth to death. As we sit here in the quiet, listening to their softly unfolding stories, perhaps we can extend them the same mercy Julian found in God's motherly heart. We can honor their pain, their strength, and their unbreakable will to endure and find meaning despite everything. In doing so, we strive to build a world where no woman must choose between a physical prison or a mental tomb to know her worth. The Church, despite its many restrictions, did offer a surprising path forward for some women, a life devoted to faith. For a select few, joining a convent meant an alternative to marriage and motherhood, a chance to gain influence and develop their minds. One remarkable example is Hildegard of Bingen, born in 1098 to a noble family in the Rhineland. As the 10th child, she was dedicated to the Church and sent to live in a monastery at just 8 years old. Rather than being crushed by this cloistered life, Hildegard blossomed. She experienced vivid mystical visions early on, which she recorded in theological writings. Her musical works ranged from stirring hymns to the earliest known morality play set to music. As an adult, Hildegard founded her own abbey and became famous across Europe as a prophet and scholar. Popes, emperors, and kings sought her spiritual guidance. Her expertise spanned religion, science, medicine, and philosophy. She treated sick nuns and villagers using her knowledge of herbal remedies. Though exceptional, Hildegard's story shows how monastic life could offer women an oasis of learning and culture. Behind abbey walls, nuns could pursue scholarship denied to married women. They spent days praying, meditating, gardening, and creating art and literature. Copying manuscripts and illuminating sacred texts were common tasks. With the freedom to read, write, and create, their minds could grow. Of course, convent life demanded sacrifices. Nuns took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, giving up worldly pleasures and attachments. Their days were tightly scheduled with prayer and labor, and they remained under male religious authority. But for women truly called to spiritual life, the convent was a refuge from the harsh outside world. Another influential religious woman was Catherine of Siena, born in 1347 to a working-class family in Italy. Deeply devout from childhood, Catherine resisted her parents' attempts to arrange a marriage. At 18, she took vows as a lay Dominican and devoted herself to prayer, fasting, and caring for the poor and sick. Like Hildegard, Catherine experienced mystical visions and was revered as a living saint. She was fearless in speaking truth to power, writing passionate letters condemning corruption and pushing church reform. When the Pope fled Rome due to political strife, Catherine traveled to France and persuaded him to return. Amid the Great Schism dividing Christianity, Catherine worked tirelessly to restore unity. Her spiritual memoir, The Dialogue, was groundbreaking, featuring intimate conversations with God at a time when the Church claimed sole authority over divine knowledge. Exhausted by her work and extreme austerity, Catherine died at just 33, her body worn but her spirit at peace. Women like Hildegard and Catherine showed the potential for greatness even within societal limits. Their faith drove lives of purpose that challenged convention. While most medieval women never imagined such influence, these monastic scholars and mystics added complexity to the era's gender dynamics. For most, though, the Church was more a force of discipline than empowerment. Parish priests and nuns upheld strict moral codes, especially around sexuality. Women's behavior was closely watched. They had to be obedient, chaste, and blameless. Stepping outside these bounds could lead to harsh punishment. The 13th century medieval Inquisition began targeting heretics, with women especially vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft and devil worship. Witchcraft was broadly defined. Anything from strange murmurs to mysterious potions could spark suspicion. Midwives and female healers became prime targets, their knowledge of childbirth and herbs branded as dark magic. A notorious witch-hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, argued that women were especially prone to the devil's temptations because of their carnal nature. It outlined interrogation techniques designed to extract confessions under torture. Those found guilty faced gruesome executions, beheading, hanging, or burning at the stake. Public spectacles meant to terrify others into submission. Though the full wave of witch hunts peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, their roots lay deep in medieval church mistrust of female power. Sometimes accusations were cynical tools to punish women who defied men or social norms. Widows or single women on society's edges were easy scapegoats. The vague crime of witchcraft became a convenient excuse to silence inconvenient women. Beyond the violence, daily spiritual life structured women's routines. Masses, feast days, and church festivals like Advent, Christmas, Lent, and Easter marked the year. Women led prayers and devotions, forming the family's pious center. Traces of older pagan traditions mingled with Christianity, bringing rougher, joyful celebrations like harvest revelries and dances, occasions where women might find moments of joy and release. Still, the church was a constant force to navigate, offering both justification for women's subjugation and rare opportunities for escape. Women walked a tightrope, expected to embody virtue while living under suspicion. Whether in the home, workplace, or church's eyes, medieval women faced relentless challenges. Yet some carved out meaning and agency, however small. In the final part of our journey, we'll meet more extraordinary women who left their mark and explore how medieval attitudes still shape gender today. The path behind us is long and winding, but new revelations await. It was up to the women to keep the home fires burning, and burn they did. They rose well before dawn each day to stoke the flames, prepare meals, care for children, and tend to the sick and elderly. There was little rest, and even less recognition, for the crucial role women played in sustaining their families and communities. Their daily work was seen as simply part of their natural duties, as inevitable as the sunrise and sunset. A woman's worth was measured not by her intelligence, talents, or dreams, but by the sons she bore, the orderliness of her home, and the obedience she showed to the men above her. The few who dared to step beyond these confining roles faced suspicion, scorn, and sometimes outright danger. Being an independent woman, or worse, an educated one, was seen as defying nature's laws. Society dictated that women were the weaker sex with a fixed place, and woe to any who strayed from it. Yet, even within these rigid hierarchies, some women managed to carve out spaces of agency and self-determination. Through sheer will, they created paths where none seemed to exist. They bent rules, found loopholes, and when nothing else worked, quietly subverted the very system designed to keep them down. These were the healers and midwives, the nuns and anchoresses, the artists and writers. They brewed ale, traded in markets, spun wool, and built cottage industries that helped support their families. While not openly defying the status quo, they challenged it every single day in their own subtle ways. One shining example was Christine de Pizan, often called Europe's first professional female writer. Born in Venice in 1364, Christine's talents were recognized and nurtured from childhood by her forward-thinking father. Educated alongside her brothers, she eagerly studied languages, classical literature, and sciences, subjects largely barred to most girls and women at the time. At 15, Christine's father arranged her marriage to a royal secretary at the French court. The match opened a new world of politics, art, and scholarly conversation. For a time, she thrived, attending salons and composing love ballads that earned respect among learned peers. But tragedy soon struck. Christine lost her father, then her beloved husband, leaving her a widow and single mother at just 25. Without male protection or support, her future looked uncertain. Yet Christine did not falter. With determination, she picked up her pen and began writing prolifically, an astonishing feat when so few women could read or write. Christine's work was remarkable both in volume and boldness. She tackled topics forbidden to women, politics, war, and society, and challenged prevailing misogyny. Her most famous book, The Book of the City of Ladies, was a powerful defense of women's intellect and worth, and a searing critique of injustice. She imagined a utopia ruled by women, free to pursue knowledge, art, and self-fulfillment without limits. This radical vision planted the seeds of feminism for centuries to come. Through her writings, Christine proved women could be serious scholars and successful authors, opening doors for future generations of female writers. Yet her story was exceptional. For most medieval women, education was an unreachable dream. Literacy was rare, and even those who could read or write often faced discouragement or outright bans from men in their lives. The belief that women's minds were inferior was so deeply ingrained it was accepted as truth. Scholars and clergy wrote endlessly about female weakness, excessive emotion, and susceptibility to temptation. These ideas had real consequences. Physicians misunderstood women's bodies. Menstrual cycles were seen as curses, menopause as madness, and childbirth was perilous, claiming many lives. Without doctors or trained midwives, women relied on folk remedies, superstition, and each other. Herbal brews eased labor pains, amulets were clutched for protection. Still, the dangers were ever present. Disease and malnutrition were widespread. Even minor injuries could become fatal infections. Life was fragile, and aging brought poverty and dependence. Widows without family support often faced destitution, begging for scraps, or living with reluctant relatives. This grim reality should never be forgotten. Our foremothers' struggles and sacrifices built the foundation for the freedoms we enjoy today. We stand on the shoulders of countless women whose names are lost to history. Yet, progress remains unfinished. Women around the world still face discrimination, violence, and oppression. Though the specifics have changed, underlying attitudes and power structures echo those medieval patterns. The road ahead is long, but remembering the Christine de Pizans, the Eleanors, and the countless nameless mothers and daughters who endured inspires us to keep pushing forward. We honor their legacy by striving for a world where every woman can live freely, fully, and without fear. Let us look at medieval women not with pity, but with respect and admiration. Their world was one of endless toil and unimaginable grief, yet they found moments of joy, resilience, and even rebellion. They were the unsung heroes of their era, the women who carried half the sky, even as the world's weight pressed heavily on their shoulders. We owe them a debt that can never truly be repaid, but we can start by remembering their stories, speaking their names, and continuing their fight. As long as injustice persists, and as long as women are denied their basic rights and dignity, their work is unfinished, and so is ours. Let us draw strength from their example, never forgetting the sacrifices they made so that one day, every woman might rise and claim her rightful place in the sun. It's a dream worth fighting for, a cause we must pursue relentlessly, for the sake of our mothers, sisters, daughters, and all generations to come. Life for medieval women was full of hardships we can barely imagine today. From the moment they were born, girls faced an uphill battle in a world set against them. Childhood was fragile and dangerous. Many didn't survive past age 5 due to disease, malnutrition, and a lack of medical knowledge. Those who lived often had to grow up too quickly. For noble girls like Isabeau of Bavaria, childhood ended abruptly. At just 15, she was sent away from her home to marry King Charles VI of France, a man she had never met, more than a decade older. Imagine the fear and uncertainty as she left everything familiar for a strange land and an uncertain future. Her marriage, like many, was arranged for political reasons. Love and personal compatibility rarely mattered. A woman's value was tied to her fertility and her ability to produce male heirs to carry on the family line, putting immense pressure on young brides like Isabeau. Complicating matters, Charles suffered from bouts of madness that could last months. He was unable to rule effectively or provide support, so much of the burden fell on Isabeau, barely a child herself. She was thrust into the demanding role of queen, managing the royal household, hosting dignitaries, patronizing the arts and charities, all while pregnant or recovering from childbirth almost every year. Despite the chaos around her, Isabeau held the French monarchy together through sheer determination. She bore Charles several children, including the future Charles VII. When her husband was incapacitated, she acted as regent, wielding authority usually reserved for men. During the 100 Years' War, she became a skilled diplomat, negotiating treaties and even leading armies into battle while heavily pregnant. Isabeau's story showcases the resilience and resourcefulness of medieval women facing immense adversity. But it also reveals how even powerful women were constrained by patriarchal attitudes and institutions. For most women, daily life was an unending cycle of hard labor and drudgery. Wealthy women like Isabeau had servants to handle cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Peasant women carried the full burden themselves alongside farming and other exhausting tasks. Peasant women's lives were defined by repetitive, physically demanding chores from dawn to dusk, fetching water, gathering firewood, feeding animals, baking bread, cooking over smoky fires, washing clothes by hand in rivers, making candles and soap from animal fat, and spinning wool into yarn, a task so common it gave unmarried women the label spinsters. They had almost no leisure time. Noble women, while freed from much menial labor, still lacked control over their own time. Outside their religious duties, they were expected to engage in respectable, feminine pastimes like needlework, music, and supervising servants, with little chance to pursue personal ambitions beyond the home. Regardless of status, nearly all medieval women shared one condition: subservience to men. Daughters answered to fathers, wives to husbands. Women had few legal rights, regarded as property transferred from one man to another. Their value was tied to their dowry, chastity, and ability to bear children. Within the home, women had little autonomy. Husbands made household decisions and controlled their wives' behavior and movements, by force if needed. Domestic violence was common, seen as a husband's duty to discipline his wife physically or otherwise if she stepped out of line. Marital rape was not even a concept. A wife's body belonged to her husband to use as he pleased. Women who defied or damaged their husband's reputation faced severe consequences. Marguerite of Flanders' wedding day abduction by her enraged husband Louis of Maille, who accused her of infidelity, is a grim example. She was imprisoned in her own castle for 2 years. Though the Pope threatened Louis with excommunication to secure her release, the scandal haunted Marguerite forever. Medieval women were damned if they did and damned if they didn't. Expected to be paragons of virtue, chastity, and obedience, their every move was scrutinized. Yet, they were seen as sinful, morally weak creatures, forever marked by Eve's original temptation. This contradiction trapped women in an impossible bind. The church and society policed their behavior relentlessly. Modesty and purity were demanded. Women were to be silent and hidden to avoid leading men into temptation. Even innocent acts like dancing or flirting could brand a woman a harlot. Punishments for unchaste behavior ranged from public whipping and dunking to exile or death. Life for medieval women was a constant tightrope walk in a world stacked against them. But despite oppression and hardship, medieval women found ways to create meaningful lives and shape their world in small but powerful ways. Take Christine de Pizan, born in Venice in 1364. Raised by a scholar father who nurtured her intellect, Christine was rare among medieval women, well-educated and multilingual. When her husband died, leaving her a widow at 25, Christine did something extraordinary for her time. Christine de Pizan emerged as Europe's first professional female author, writing poetry, books, and essays that boldly challenged the widespread misogyny of her era. She argued passionately for equality between men and women. In her landmark work, The Book of the City of Ladies, Christine imagined a symbolic city inhabited by women celebrated for their virtue and achievements throughout history. By shining a light on the worth and accomplishments of women at a time when they were frequently belittled, Christine planted early seeds of what we now call feminism. Her revolutionary ideas would inspire thinkers for centuries. Christine wasn't alone in breaking medieval molds. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, made groundbreaking contributions to theology, medicine, botany, and music composition. Joan of Arc, the teenage peasant girl who led French armies to astonishing victories during the Hundred Years' War, became a legendary symbol of female power. These exceptional women offer a glimpse into the untapped strength and potential that many of their forgotten contemporaries likely shared. It's easy to get lost in the endless list of hardships medieval women endured and overlook their incredible spirit. Yes, their lives were filled with brutal challenges by today's standards, but their humanity, grit, and courage remain undeniable. The average medieval woman's life was a cycle of exhausting work, suffocating limits, and constant threat of violence. Yet they endured, surviving through ingenuity, determination, and the bonds of family and friendship. Against the odds, they found moments of joy, resilience, and even rebellion. Their legacy is often overshadowed in history books, which focus more on great men. But by learning about their struggles and small triumphs, we deepen our understanding of the human story. Their strength and resilience have always been the backbone of society, regardless of whether they were recognized or free. Christine de Pizan's words capture this beautifully. No matter where I turn, I see nothing but the cruelty of men toward women. Yet God knows women are not a different species from men. They are human beings just as much as men are. Though centuries apart, her message remains painfully relevant. Medieval European women faced extreme hardships, yet the underlying inequalities and prejudices that confined them echo through time and cultures. The battle for genuine female empowerment and equality is one of the most enduring struggles in human history, and it continues today. Reflecting on the lives of medieval women, the endless labor, the harsh restrictions, the fierce spirit gives us strength. They remind us how far we've come and how much remains to be done. From birth, girls faced disadvantage. Many died young due to poor care and conditions. Education was minimal, focused on basic literacy, religious teachings, and skills to become good wives and mothers. Unlike boys, girls weren't taught academic subjects or allowed to pursue careers. Their futures were predetermined. Early marriages, often in the teens, were arranged to secure political or business alliances, with little regard for the girl's wishes. She was effectively traded as property from father to husband. Take Isabeau of Bavaria. At 15, she was sent from home to marry King Charles VI of France, a man many years older. She left all she knew to join a foreign court and care for a husband prone to mental illness. As queen, she bore the heavy burden of managing the royal household, bearing heirs, and navigating power struggles. Her story highlights the lack of agency most medieval women had over their marriages. Fathers or brothers arranged unions to improve family status, without considering the bride's consent. Once married, women were under their husband's control, expected to obey and manage households while bearing children, especially sons. Failure to produce a male heir was blamed on the wife and could lead to shame or rejection. Childbirth was perilous. Maternal mortality was high, with many women dying from hemorrhage or infection. Babies also faced grim odds, with disease and malnutrition common. Even queens like Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, endured numerous pregnancies with many child losses, suffering lasting health effects. Despite the risks, women were expected to continue bearing children as their duty to family and society, regardless of their own suffering. Their needs were secondary to their husband's desires and the family's reputation. Beyond pregnancy, a typical medieval housewife's life was unending toil. She was on call 24/7, responsible for cooking, cleaning, childcare, sewing, gardening, preserving food, and tending livestock. Her work rarely paused for rest or leisure. She rose before dawn to stoke fires and begin chores, working until her family slept. Depending on social class, a housewife might have maidservants, but managing them added more work. Poor women had no such help, performing all tasks in cramped, poorly ventilated homes. Laundry involved boiling water, soap made from animal fat, and scrubbing clothes on washboards, a backbreaking process. No machines to ease the burden, no washing machines or vacuum cleaners, just hard, relentless elbow grease. Without indoor plumbing, women dealt with the less glamorous chores like emptying chamber pots and cleaning outdoor privies. They hauled heavy buckets of water from the nearest well or stream multiple times a day for cooking, bathing, and household chores. Running taps were unheard of. Every drop required effort. Preparing meals was an all-consuming task. With no refrigeration or canned goods, food had to be cooked fresh daily, requiring careful planning and time. Women slaughtered and butchered animals, plucked fowl, smoked meats, and cured fish, a whole arsenal of skills essential for feeding the family. Then there was the making and mending of clothes. In an era without ready-made or store-bought garments, a housewife crafted wardrobes from scratch. Spinning yarn, weaving fabric, cutting patterns, and sewing could take weeks for just one item. When clothes wore out, they patched and darned them for extra life before starting over. On top of all this were the constant demands of childcare, kitchen gardening, tending the sick with herbal remedies, and possibly making cheese, candles, or ale to bring in extra income. Running a medieval household required immense stamina, skill, and sacrifice. There was little space for anything else. Even noblewomen, despite their servants, were expected to supervise household affairs and engage in tasks like needlework themselves. Though they escaped the roughest chores, their lives remained tightly controlled, especially compared to their husbands who enjoyed freedoms in politics, business, and war. From the richest lady to the poorest peasant, medieval women faced endless labor, little rest, and scant appreciation. They rose before dawn and worked long after others slept, always deferring to male authority. Their work was never done, and yet it rarely earned them credit. While anchorites like Julian of Norwich found purpose in solitude and prayer, other religious women took a more active role. The 13th century rise of mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans opened new avenues for women to serve both God and society. Lay sisters, or tertiaries, took vows but lived in the world, running hospitals, teaching children, caring for the poor and sick. These women moved more freely than cloistered nuns. One famous tertiary was Saint Catherine of Siena. Born in 1347 into a large Italian family, Catherine embraced a strict spiritual life early on, resisting her parents' wishes for marriage. Unusually literate for her time, she corresponded with church leaders, even boldly reprimanding the Pope for residing in France rather than Rome. Her persistence helped convince Pope Gregory XI to return the papacy to Rome in 1377. Catherine's compassion was profound. During the plague, she tended to the sick and dying, treating wounds without fear for herself, seeing Christ in every suffering soul. Yet, even these devoted women operated within a rigid patriarchal system that limited female voices. Only the exceptional reached positions of influence, and always under male authority. For most medieval women, sainthood or political clout were out of reach. They toiled daily, bearing the many hardships imposed on their gender. It's hard for us today to fully grasp their lack of control over their lives and bodies. From birth, a woman belonged to the men around her. First her father, then her husband, maybe her son in widowhood. She had little say over marriage, children, or labor. Education, property rights, and legal protections against abuse were minimal to non-existent. Yet portraying medieval women solely as passive victims misses their full humanity. Within narrow confines, they carved out meaning and wielded whatever power they could. They built support networks with female kin and friends, took pride in their children, handiwork, and faith. Everyday acts of resilience shone through. A village woman gathering herbs to heal a sick child, an abused wife seeking refuge in a convent, a noble daughter persuading her father for a delayed marriage. Their strength may have been hidden but was no less real. Though medieval women had little control over history's grand currents, politics, religion, and society, they did what they needed to survive. And if luck favored them, they found moments of joy and purpose. One acceptable outlet was storytelling. In castles, women shared romantic tales of knights and ladies while working embroidery. In villages, as women spun and wove, they passed down legends and fairy tales from mothers and grandmothers. Storytelling entertained, taught lessons, and allowed dreams of a brighter world beyond daily drudgery. Though medieval women left few personal writings, their stories shaped culture, kept alive by oral traditions. And today, when we engage with history, wondering about their struggles and small victories, we continue this lineage, stitching a richer understanding of our shared human journey. As we close this journey through medieval women's lives, take a moment to picture them all, queens and peasants, nuns and brewers, teenage brides and weary widows. Real people with fears, flaws, and surprising courage, not so different from us. As you drift to sleep, dream of their stories, their quiet strength, and how they paved the way for freedoms we often take for granted. Honor their memory, and join in the ongoing effort to build a world where every person, regardless of gender, can live freely and choose their own path. Thank you for traveling through these forgotten corners of history with me. If you found this meaningful or calming, please like and subscribe for more deep explorations of our fascinating and inspiring past. There are countless stories left to tell, and I look forward to sharing them with you. Sweet dreams. As we draw the curtain on this deep exploration of medieval womanhood, it becomes clear that the lives of women during the Middle Ages were defined by a complex interplay of hardship, resilience, oppression, and quiet rebellion. These were not simply passive figures relegated to the margins of history. They were the very foundation upon which families, communities, and societies were built, even when their voices were silenced or overlooked by the chroniclers of their time. From the moment a girl was born in this era, the odds were stacked against her. The medieval world was a place where survival was never guaranteed, and the harsh realities of disease, malnutrition, and limited medical knowledge made childhood itself a perilous journey. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high, and those who managed to reach their 5th birthday often had to grow up quickly, stepping into roles shaped not by their dreams or desires but by the rigid expectations of a patriarchal society. Education for girls was minimal, narrowly focused on preparing them to become obedient wives and mothers. Their intellectual potential was dismissed or outright discouraged by the dominant belief that women were naturally inferior in mind and spirit. This belief was so deeply ingrained that it was echoed in the teachings of the Church, the writings of scholars, and the laws that governed daily life. Women were taught to be modest, submissive, and silent, to exist primarily in service to the men around them. Marriage, far from being a romantic union, was a transaction, a political or economic alliance designed to secure family fortunes and strengthen social ties. Girls as young as 12 were often promised to husbands they barely knew, thrust into households where their consent was irrelevant. Their primary role was to bear children, preferably sons, to continue the lineage and secure inheritance. Failure to do so could lead to scorn, neglect, or worse. The reality of childbirth was terrifying. Without the medical advancements we take for granted today, pregnancy was a constant gamble with death. Women like Eleanor of Castile, who bore many children despite great personal cost, exemplify the physical toll exacted by these expectations. The trauma of repeated pregnancies, the pain of losing children, and the ever-present risk of fatal complications were realities faced by women across social strata, from queens to peasants. Yet beyond the biological and domestic challenges, medieval women endured a social order that tightly controlled their bodies, their behaviors, and their very identities. Husbands held legal authority over wives, fathers over daughters, and the Church upheld a moral code that framed women as inherently sinful and in need of strict supervision. Domestic violence was not just tolerated but often justified as discipline. Consent was an alien concept. A wife's body belonged to her husband, to be used as he pleased. Accusations of witchcraft, often leveled against women who stepped outside narrow societal roles or who possessed knowledge of healing and herbs, underscore the dangerous terrain women navigated. Midwives, healers, widows, and outspoken women were vulnerable to persecution, torture, and execution based on flimsy evidence and deep-seated fears of female power. The chilling echoes of these medieval witch hunts reverberate even into modern times, reminding us of how easily misogyny can manifest in violence and control. Yet, amid this landscape of limitation and fear, women found ways to assert their agency, however small. They supported one another, formed networks of care and solidarity, and created pockets of influence within the constraints imposed upon them. Some, like Christine de Pizan, pushed intellectual boundaries and challenged misogynistic narratives with bold, pioneering works that celebrated women's strength and potential. Others, like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena, used spiritual life as a platform to gain authority and effect change, though always within a patriarchal framework. Even the everyday acts of tending children, managing households, creating art and textiles, and telling stories were profound forms of resilience. Through these, medieval women sustained their families, nurtured their communities, and preserved cultural traditions. Storytelling, in particular, served as a vital tool for education, entertainment, and hope, a way to imagine worlds beyond their immediate hardships and to pass wisdom from one generation to the next. When we consider the lives of medieval women in their full complexity, the suffering, the endurance, the courage, we gain a more nuanced understanding of history. We see that women were not just victims of their circumstances but active participants in shaping their worlds, even if history has too often erased their contributions. Their stories enrich our view of the past and offer powerful lessons for the present. These lessons are especially relevant today as we recognize that many of the struggles medieval women faced, inequality, lack of autonomy, violence, and the policing of women's bodies, persist in various forms worldwide. While significant progress has been made, the fight for gender equality continues. By remembering the women who endured in the darkest of times, we honor their legacy and renew our commitment to a future where every woman can live with dignity, safety, and freedom. It's also a reminder of the power of knowledge and storytelling. By uncovering and sharing the stories of these medieval women, the queens and peasants, nuns and rebels, we challenge the historical narratives that have marginalized them. We give voice to those silenced by centuries of patriarchy, creating a richer, more inclusive history that reflects the full spectrum of human experience. Furthermore, their lives encourage us to reflect on resilience and hope in the face of adversity. The strength shown by women who survived harsh realities, cared for others, and quietly defied limitations is a testament to human endurance. These stories inspire us to confront contemporary injustices with courage and compassion, knowing that change is possible through persistent effort. In closing, the lives of medieval women remind us that history is not merely a record of kings, battles, and grand events, but also the everyday realities of people who lived, loved, struggled, and persevered. It is through their experiences that we connect to our shared humanity. Their endurance laid the groundwork for the freedoms we enjoy and the ongoing quest for equality. As you reflect on their stories tonight, may you feel a profound respect for these women who bore so much with grace and courage. May their resilience ignite your own determination to work toward a just and equitable world, where every individual, regardless of gender, can claim their rightful place in the sun. Their lives, often hidden in the shadows, deserve to shine brightly in our collective memory. Let us honor their legacy by continuing to tell their stories, fight for their rights, and ensure that no woman ever again has to face the world with her voice silenced and her potential stifled. This is more than history. It's a call to action, a reminder of the long road traveled and the miles still ahead. And in carrying their stories forward, we keep alive the flame of progress, illuminating the path toward a future where equality is not just an ideal but a reality for all.